Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pie Before Dinner. This is Dr. Lou. I am here in the studio with a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Ebony McGee from Vanderbilt University, National STEM Scholar and author. You are listening to Pie Before Dinner, Talking Math with Dr. Lou. The title of our show tonight, episode number 30. The title of our show tonight is Black, Brown, and Bruised in STEM. And I am here with Dr. Ebony McGee, who has written a book. Dr. McGee, welcome to the show. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I almost gave away the title of your book is so exciting, and it was just a fitting title for the show, Black, Brown, and Bruised in STEM. And so I'm so excited for your work. The audience, there's always a background to the guests that I bring on the show. And Ebony, I've known you for several years. You were one of the first scholars that I came across who envisioned a broad agenda of engineering in the school system, engineering for young people, engineering for Black communities at such at earlier ages. I'd always thought of engineering as some professional space that one takes on after one finishes college or maybe perhaps goes to college. But you've always advocated for STEM, the journey of engineering and the journey of STEM at such an early age. I know that your work has involved collecting these stories, these powerful journeys into engineering, into STEM. But tell us a little bit about your own journey into engineering.
Okay. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be back with my homie, so I appreciate the invitation. So I was really good in math and science, and I was raised on the south side of Chicago. What's up if anybody's from Chi-Town? And I was encouraged to go into summer programs, and the summer programs were largely steeped in engineering. So in my sophomore and junior And what that allowed me to do is it gave me good language to talk about when I wrote my scholarships, and it gave me, the repertoire of being seen as an engineer. That's when I learned what engineering was, and I could kind of speak to speak. I went to undergrad at a historically Black college, North Carolina A&T State University, Aggie Pride, for any Aggies out there. And Okay, thank you. And I majored in electrical engineering, and I didn't really have to worry about feeling like I was an imposter in that space because, the teachers look like me, or even if they didn't look like me, they knew that their job was to teach brilliant Black folks. You see what I'm saying? So it was a different mindset. And, it was just a really affirming place to be, an affirming place to learn engineering. And then I got my master's at New Jersey Institute of Technology. That was less Black, but it was still, very ethnically diverse. So I kind of thrived in that environment too. And then I went to work, and that's when the bottom just dropped off. So my colleagues were mostly white. The only other Black woman there was a receptionist. We often got mistaken for each other, although she was almost like a foot taller than me. So it's just remarkable how we could be twins. And just in every day, in very, very subtle ways, I would be made to feel as though I don't belong or I don't have the same intellectual capability as my colleagues. And being an engineer, I didn't know anything about racial microaggressions or racial battle fatigue and, even imposter syndrome, which I actually think is a camouflage for just like plain old racism. But I didn't have the language to talk about all of these things. And my community back in Chicago was really, really proud of me. So here I had the pressure of kind of upholding, trying to feel good about a space that was making me feel miserable. And I just thought I was going to stay with it and start getting on some prescriptions or whatever, just to try to cope with the trauma and the fatigue I felt. Like even the ride to work, as I got closer and closer to the exit, my body would just do like weird things, like turn around, girl. You don't need to be here. So I actually got laid off. And I think it's important that I tell that story because on my CV, you just see everything going up, steady, nice climb, but our life is really more like this. So when I got laid off and I picked myself up off the floor, I decided to reinvent myself. And I wonder, were other STEMers also having a very similar experience, either at a predominantly white institution or by virtue of their work environment?
Listen, Ebony. I can tell just by listening to you that you have spent a lot of time with thinking about your story, and it amazes me when I listen to yourself and I've listened to others who have come on this program when they talk about their experiences, how much of it is one so similar, but if we slow it down, it's really like you've said at least 10 different things. I'm like, wow, why, why should we have to experience these kinds of things? So I was in Clubhouse the other day. I don't know if you're on Clubhouse, but Clubhouse is a tremendous platform. But I've been seeing Clubhouse is, for those in the listening audience, an new audio platform, in which people come together and can talk, right? Can talk. There are moderators and there are rooms and can talk. It's only available to iPhone users in the iPhone space, but that's going to be. I suspect Clubhouse is almost like the new NPR, and that's going to probably really take over some of our platforms, in my view. But anyway, I was in one talking about STEM, and I was amazed at how many Black STEMers I ran into. Ebony, when I came into mathematics, I didn't see, particularly as a professor, I didn't see, I run this thing in my head. I didn't see those kinds of people in STEM, but it was nice to see in this media the veil had been lifted and I could see these or hear the voices and talk to people who were in STEM, Black men and women who have these experiences in STEM. And I'm so amazed that there are so many of us in this field when the narrative has been that we are few and far between. What's your thoughts on that? Are there more of us than we think, or is this the narrative of the lone person in isolation? Is that also a competing narrative in the space?
Hmm. This is a good question because I graduated with hundreds. Let me hear
Mm-hmm.
you. Hundreds of engineers, mathematicians, scientists, computer scientists. You can't tell me we don't exist, but for some reason, you can't find us. Like, where
Yeah,
are you looking? Are you
yeah.
looking at the same 32 institutions where you employ, 95% of your STEM workforce? Or are you
Mm-hmm.
looking at HBCUs? Are you respecting the tradition of MSIs and how they also cultivate brilliance, right? I mean, we got these institutions, Harvard, Yale. Look what they have done to our society. I mean, look what those folks in Congress who got all those nice Yale degrees, like we are actually going back to these universities and say, what kind of responsibility do you have to, cater to and promote and maybe educate folks to be white supremacists? And
Mm-hmm.
here
Mm-hmm.
you got Black folks all over. We're still graduating 40, 50,000 a year, but somehow you can't find us because you don't care where you look. You only want to look in those certain places and spaces. And it's a travesty. Me and a friend of mine, we were just trying to think of any faculty at all who got their PhD from an HBCU in STEM and a PWI, predominantly white institution, hired them right off the bat. We came up with two.
Wow.
Two,
You better
right?
stop because what you just said just hurt me because I remember when I got my PhD from a PWI, but I did my master's degree at Alabama A&M University.
Okay,
And
okay.
I met Dr. Shipman, who was head of the mathematics program there, and he was the first Black person, the first person who gave me a chance, an opportunity, and believed in me as a mathematics educator. and so I'm so thankful for that. But I remember applying for a job at a university in Chicago, and they called my university, the one I was working on my PhD at Illinois State,
Mhm.
and they called my university. The chair called my university and said, um, "Is this guy?" They started to ask, "Was I too critical? Was I too in terms of critical race theory? Did were my beliefs about social justice and culturally relevant pedagogy too much of a threat for their particular program?" And
Wow.
so they didn't. And this was before the interview, so they didn't invite me to an interview, and it was because of that inquiry into the kind of work that I was doing. That
Yeah. These STEM departments tend to reproduce their own, not just by
yeah.
skin color, not just by the neighborhoods they grew up, not just by the schools that they attended, but by the very ideologies and values that they hold dear, right?
Hmm.
I mean, the
Hmm.
whole thing, there is so much power in STEM. Like, folks are scared of Donald Trump, and he is somebody scary, but I'm scared of Mark Zuckerberg. I'm scared of Jeff Bezos. Look at all the power and
Hmm.
privileges that these folks
Yeah.
get being at the top of the STEM helm. And I'm always talking about the revolution, but if we had the revolution tomorrow, we probably would have to use Apple products. If we talking about Uziing up, that they wouldn't be from us. Like, we don't own practically anything, right? So even when we're thinking about, well, what are we asking people of color to pursue STEM to what end? It
Hmm.
shouldn't be to work in a racially toxic place like Facebook, like many toxic places that we're seeing. Google can't seem to hold a Black woman, and I mean, it's just ridiculous what is happening. But the message often is that the end goal should be to work for a Google, not to be a Google, but better, because you're going to put that racial justice in there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
really need
Yeah.
to change our mindset. But
Yeah.
I meet so many, many, many people who started off in STEM and got at the door. You have to leave your racial identity. You have to leave your
Hmm.
culture.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
got to don't have red hair. All kind of
Hmm.
things that have nothing to do with one's brilliance and one's intellect. I just read the book by Stacey Abrams. She was going to major in physics. And
Hmm.
one of her teachers at Morehouse, so sometimes the stuff is internal, we don't want to talk about that,
That's right.
encouraged her not that physics wasn't for her. And I mean, we all are better for whatever she decided to do, but why couldn't she be a physicist and still brilliant on the, get out the vote campaign? So we're losing a population of folks that don't need convincing. Like, these are STEMers, and we're losing them not because of the STEM, but because of the toxic culture.
Listen, I can go story after story of people that I have met who have been intentionally on the worst, on the best of days, not unintentionally, but I think a lot of it is this intentional counseling away from STEM. You're a girl, you're a woman. Maybe you should try this. Maybe you should try that. I have seen so many stories. In fact, I had some teachers on here on the show several months ago, and I asked them how they got into teachers. There's three African American women, and they each talked about how they left engineering, left the STEM space, right? And so you talk about this exodus out of STEM, right? How pervasive we talked about, where can we find them? They're in the HBCUs. They're. You even talk about they're in these non-traditional places, right? These people who didn't even go to school, the kinds of networks, not the formal networks that we find ourselves in. That's where you find them. But once we get in the space, how pervasive is the pressure to be discouraged out of it? The exodus.
Well, the exodus is real. About
Mm-hmm.
20% only stay in engineering and science for Blacks. But for
Wow.
Latinx, only 32% stay. And for Asians, only 40% stay. So
Wow.
nobody's doing great in STEM. Like STEM straight up needs a makeover. It's not producing,
Mhm.
lots of attrition in any no. I'm sorry. Whites were at 32. Latinx are somewhere between 25 and 27, right? So whites
Mm.
are at 32%, Asians are at 40%. And people are really surprised when I say only 40% of Asians in science and engineering end up with a degree after 6 years, because remember, we have the model minority myth, that is perpetrating that Asians are just all innately successful in STEM, and that can be farthest from the truth. 60% of Asians don't make it in science and engineering, right? So
Yeah.
STEM hasn't really done good by anybody, but those trajectories run better for whites and Asians than they do for Black and Latinx. The reasons why are multiple. I mean, first of all, the curriculum is founded in slavery and Jim Crow. Like you can
Mhm.
open up a physics book and never see anybody that looks like you. And you don't believe that, physics was actually created in a continent that we now call Africa, right? So we're just not even acknowledging the rich history and innovations of, African people and even enslaved Black people who often had their inventions stolen or even buried. Like if anybody finds out about this, it's going to break the ideology that you are inferior. So I'm actually going to bury this innovation. And it's just a shame that, why would we as a society shoot our own selves in the foot just so we can maintain a superiority complex? STEM also hides behind being neutral, being innocent, being non-political, all these things that we know that are valued in STEM, but it can perpetrate, around this innocence.
Let's talk about that a little bit, Ebony, because and it starts even in our training. When I was taught about the rationales, when I think about the rationales for doing mathematics and science, we talk about being number one in the world. We talk about the threats of China, the threats of India. Uh, Back
That's
then, it was the threats of Japan,
it.
and so even in my own training, we talked about Sputnik, right? The history of Sputnik. So we've always tied in the threat of the danger stem to some fierce space, right? But it goes beyond that, right? How much of a how troubling is the history of STEM for people of color, even beyond Sputnik? Have you seen it in our history beyond Sputnik? Let's say slavery and so forth.
Yeah. So the founder of Silicon Valley, Stockley, was a white eugenicist and a white supremacist. And then we wonder why Silicon Valley, the companies that come out of Silicon Valley, can't seem to figure out what to do with, marginalized people of color, right? So you
Mm.
have to go back to the history. The history is so telling. Even when we think about our highways, this was one of the ways to break up the Black community. And who did this? Civil engineers, design highways such that they would bust up the Black community. You would have higher rates of asthma. You would have higher rates of police activity, et cetera. So it did so much for
Mm.
our neighborhoods. But we often think about monuments. So let's tear down monuments, but we also need to think about dismantling highways, because highways are more destructive. Having a highway bust through a Black community and tear that community in half is much more destructive than a monument. When we think about, enslaved Black people, like I just said, their inventions were buried or stolen. So even though we hear about the traffic light and all stuff like that, there's a host of inventions that'll never be associated with Black people because their white slave masters stole them. And then when you even think about the Middle Passage, somebody had to build a slave ship that could house 250, 300 bodies horizontally for months on end. And how do you force feed people during this? Oh, yes, yes, yes. So how do you force feed people? How do people use the bathroom? Engineers built that ship, right? So there's horrors that are perpetrated through our society, and we don't ever indict stemmers for their role in this. And when we think
You
about
know,
even survey,
yeah.
oh, I just want to give one more example. So when we even think
Hmm.
about facial recognition and Black people being surveillance, surveillance as threats, you got to go back to you got to go back to 1731, when in New York, where Blacks and indigenous people had to walk around with lanterns at night. So white anybody, like a woman, a child, can identify them and then ask them, why are they out? Because the only reason they could be out is for their slave master. So when you think about the facial recognition of today, you got to think about a lantern was a facial recognition device. It was just 1731. So we're just improving on the racist ideologies that were founded in STEM.
And even now we know that AI and facial recognition technologies have a racist space in that, even in how they detect Black faces, and how they sometimes unable to properly distinguish people of color. You've said a lot. Look, in my country, I come from Bermuda, and in my country, we are famous for the sloop design. Now, the sloop design is the design of sailing ships where the mast is, well, let me see. The mast is at an angle. So I don't know if you can see my thing right, but the mast goes back at an angle. So if ships before that, you'll see steamships, and they would go, and sailing ships, they would be straight up. But we designed the Bermuda sloop design, and you'll see the mast at an angle, and it allows the sailing ship to go upwind. But those ships were famous because they were allowed to break the blockade. If you remember, during the Civil War, the British blockade, the northern blockade of the South, and so it allowed our country to use its ships to run the blockade, so that the South could continue to be supplied during slavery. So even in the STEM design history in my own country, there's a role that plays in the promulgation of white supremacy and slavery and harm to people. And it's interesting getting people to understand that there's a certain violence that can be associated with how we utilize STEM, and has always been perpetuated on and around Black people. So there's a responsibility, right? And you talk about this responsibility. You talk about, I'm going to put you on the spot, but you talk about a STEM revolution. In your thinking about a STEM revolution, what are your leading thoughts around that? When you think about that and your message around that, what is it?
Yeah, so a lot of what we like to do in the academy is kind of piecemeal, so we like to have things like implicit bias training, or, training to hire a diverse faculty member, because, we can't seem to figure out how to do that. And then once they get there, we can't seem to figure out how to retain them, so we do all these little things. And then, we have these mentoring programs where we try to mentor students of color to learn how to assimilate into a toxic white supremacist system of STEM, right? So not to try to dismantle the system. So thus we try to fix the students instead of trying to fix the system, right? So what I'm saying is that implicit bias is a thing, but these are not police officers that need to make split-second decisions if someone lives or dies. These are faculty members who spend hours and, countless hours with students. So for them to still want to hide behind that their bias is implicit, is faulty. And, we're not doing anything to help out people of color if we just continue to perpetuate that everything is just unconscious and, white people don't know what they're doing. Right. So we really need to start talking about explicit bias and the ways in which they are, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally, but catering towards white supremacist ideologies and values within STEM places and spaces. So in order to do that, what you need to do is very difficult. So if you are an old white man in STEM, what you really need to do, if you got a nice little nest egg, retire, get out the way. Okay. And if you're not ready to do that, if you're not ready to make that bold move, then at least say that you want to give up some of your power to ensure that we have more diverse faculty. We've got to stop bringing students of color into places and spaces and be surprised when they're feeling some kind of way and there's no faculty of color, or there's that one faculty of color, and that person has the responsibility, of mentoring all the students. So you got to dismantle the structure, that foundation where, you have courses that were made when my grandmother couldn't go to the same school as their grandmother. She couldn't drink out of the same water fountain. Like, this is what we're still teaching, right? Where you don't see us in the curriculum at all. So that is a dismantling of the current toxic white STEM culture that's producing toxicity in STEM products.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that you call this out, and we live in a world that I think Black communities, I'm thinking about the parents who have children who are going to college and taking up STEM careers and occupations. We often try to force feed children into programs that show this kind of toxicity and violence towards them, and we want them to go to great schools that have this, these PWIs that have these name recognition programs, and they go to these programs and they struggle. I mean, I hear so many cases of isolation and struggle, and it ties back to something you said earlier, right? The respect for HBCUs, and you've mentioned before, Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges, right? I mean, there are other places where there are an abundance of talented people and talented Black people for us to move into the STEM space and renovate it, revigorate it, and revolutionize it. And even people who are outside of these pipelines, right? And we talk about pipeline, but outside of these, I think of the barbershops. I think of my uncle, the potter, my other uncle, the plumber, the carpenter. I think of these people who develop these practical STEM skill sets, who are just talents that we have not drawn on enough, right? I like what you say. You talk about in one of your presentations towards a STEM revolution. You talk about several things. I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things you talk about.
Wow.
One of the things that, I did my research. One of the things you talk about is retraining STEM faculty and industry leaders for decolonization. I hear a lot of things, but I don't hear people talking about that.
So, I mean, this is the way to kind of like get white STEMers off the hook for their guilt. So they've been taught the same racist stuff that we've been taught, right? And they have a certain level of deniability about that, but it is the way the system has been taught. So if you really want to be an ally or co-conspirator or have, more racial justice in STEM, we need to decolonize you too, right? I mean, the things that you've learned are also part of the problem, right? So we just have this like mass decolonization, with white folks that would have to be coupled with anti-racist training, with Black folks that would have to be talking about ways that you can take risks and not have the whole community be penalized, for failure, because failure is kind of this thing that is expected of STEM. But when you're Black and you fail, you normally fail, like you naturally fail, like, a lot of mediocre white guys do, it is almost like a blanket against you and every other Black person in your, ecosystem. So, we don't think about risks in the same way, right? So we need like people of color decolonization, and white folks need a decolonization coupled with anti-racist ideology.
That's whoa, you said that last phrase. That last phrase is so critical and so important. Ebony, I'm so glad you are in this space. I want to just push on that point. There's one more point I really want to bring out before we head out. But one of the things you talk about is, one of the things I've heard quite a bit when we talk about people of color, Black folk in STEM, we talk about the table of STEM and this inclusive table, and we need more. The common phrase is we need more Black people at the table, right? Whether it's mathematics or science, technology, engineering, but you have keeping with your theme towards STEM revolution, you have a unique take on that. What should we do, or what's your approach when it comes to that question? We need more Black folk at the table.
So what the solution has been to have a couple of Black folk at the table, but we ain't on the menu. We haven't designed the table. We really have no input. And the input that we do have is teach us all about diversity and how to be not so racist, but still kind of racist for free. So like that's what Black folks have been. But in STEM, we are STEM knowledge makers.
Mm-hmm. And you're just dropping out slightly. Hopefully you'll get back. I just want to take this opportunity, guys. If you have not, sorry, Ebony, just dropped out a quick bit. Before I let's take a quick break, Ebony. I want to show people your book. I'm just gonna put up on the screen, guys. You can get the book, Black, Brown, and Bruised: How Racialized STEM Education Stifles Innovation. And it's powerful. Ebony and I have had Dr. McGee, sorry, and I have had some powerful conversations about the engineering pipeline in our schools and the lack thereof. And I've just been so energized by your work. I'm so happy for your book. This book was just recently released. Am I right?
It was a release in October. Yes, very recent.
Just released in October. So go ahead and get it, guys. In the comments, you'll see a link to her book. Listen, if you are not reading books by people of color, Black people in STEM, powerful Black women in STEM, then you are not reading STEM. And so if you're looking towards changing the space and face of STEM, these are the kinds of things you need to be reading. Ebony, so you wrote an article, a study, as a precursor to this book, right? It must have been, I think it was called Black, Brown, and Bruised. I can't remember, but it was your precursor work. We've just included in our course, our STEM course, as required reading at Urban Teachers.
Well,
and so I want you to know that your work is making its rounds in the space. And so this book is going on the list. It wasn't out by the time we started the course, but it's going to make it on the list. And so thank you so much for the things that you're doing. So go ahead and get that book, Black, Brown, Bruised: How Racialized STEM Education Stifles Innovation. Go ahead, Ebony, continue what you were saying.
I don't know where you want me to reset it.
The table. You said listen, the point that really stuck out was we're not even we keep trying to have a place at the table when we're not even on the menu.
We're not, right? And when we are included at the table, the goal is often teach us everything you know about diversity and how we can be better for free. But remember, Black people didn't put we didn't create white supremacist spaces and places. So we alone cannot dismantle them, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to need some really powerful white men and women to kind of step up and lead as co-conspirators in this, fight. And the fight has to be a fight from the foundation on up. So you can't just change the legs of the table. You have to dismantle the table. You have to chop it up in little bits. And then we have to start over with people of color leading the way.
Yeah, creating a table, creating the menu as well. And thank you very much. You are listening to Pie Before Dinner, Talking Math with Dr. Lou. I have with me in studio Dr. Ebony McGee of Vanderbilt University, National STEM Scholar and author. And you, Dr. McGee, are leading the way. I want to thank you on behalf of our audience tonight and for coming on air and talking with us about STEM. We wish you the very best. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening into episode number 30, Pie Before Dinner. Can you believe it? 30 episodes. Next week, we'll be continuing our Black History Month series with another, let's see, I'll show you that. Challenging white supremacy and the M word. It's a great continuation on what Dr. McGee has been talking about tonight. We'll be with Mr. Albert Cook, a social studies educator, a phenomenal social studies educator. We'll be talking about challenging white supremacy and the M word. That's the M that's in STEM, the M mathematics. And so I'm so excited to have him here next week. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening to Pie Before Dinner. I am Dr. Lou. Have a great evening. See you again next week.
Bye.